Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are undertaking a meticulous deconstruction of something that most of us, when we look at a map, we just take it as a given.
The lines.
The lines, exactly. The lines that define a nation. Specifically, we are diving deep into the foundational map of Pakistan.
Right.
You might assume the creation of a nation's border is, mostly about surveyors, mountains, population counts. But what if the boundary itself was first conceived, defined, and finalized as a legal argument?
As a piece of constitutional logic.
Yes, long before it was ever drawn on the physical ground.
That is the core, and I think deeply intellectual paradox we are grappling with today. We're leveraging the extensive constitutional research by Zahir Ahmad Mir, particularly insights from his work Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan.
Okay.
And our mission is really to move beyond the usual political narrative and to truly grasp how Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was trained as a very precise lawyer, approached this whole concept of territory.
So he didn't see geography as just land.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He transformed it into a defining ideology.
Because for Jinnah, this wasn't about land acquisition in the traditional sort of emotional sense, was it?
No.
It was about establishing the necessary constitutional home, the legal address, if you will, for a nation's rights. This idea, it really reframes everything. The map of Pakistan, from this perspective, was drafted first as an elaborate constitutional brief.
Complete with footnotes and legal citations.
Exactly, before it ever became a cartographical reality.
Precisely. And understanding this is, I think, essential to unlocking the deep structure of the entire movement. Jinnah saw defined territory not as a piece of desirable real estate, but as an indispensable legal requirement for sovereignty.
Indispensable.
The rationale was simple but profound. Without clearly defined sovereign jurisdiction, the Muslim population, though numerically huge, would remain a dispersed minority group.
Just scattered.
Forever. They would be perpetually subject to the legislative will of a permanent majority, regardless of any, constitutional guarantees offered on paper.
So the central argument we're exploring is that these boundaries were fundamentally the mechanism that defined belonging.
Yes.
And that the physical space, the territory itself, was architecturally engineered to shape a new national identity during those critical, high-stakes weeks of 1947.
And Mir just captures this perfectly. He has this observation that Pakistan began as a legal geography, a claim for self-governance expressed through boundaries.
A legal geography. That phrase is powerful.
That phrase, legal geography, is the critical takeaway of this whole first part. It elevates the discussion from, say, a communal demand to a functional legal necessity.
So why was that constitutional definition so vital?
Well, because self-governance, which was the ultimate political goal, is a concept that's entirely meaningless without a defined, recognized area of operation.
Right. You can't govern nothing.
You can't. If a group claims fundamental rights, cultural autonomy, economic self-determination, religious freedom, they must also claim the physical jurisdiction where those rights can be legally enforced, protected, and sustained by a sovereign entity.
And what's truly fascinating is this was not some sudden knee-jerk political reaction to the chaos of the 1940s.
Not at all.
The sources highlight that Jinnah had been arguing for this exact concept, that political identity must be anchored by defined jurisdiction for decades.
We can trace the structural legal demand back to at least 1916.
1916, so the Lucknow Pact era.
That's right. He wasn't just reacting to immediate political friction. He was working on a long-term structural demand.
You expand on that? 1916 is very early.
Well, yes. Looking at the context of 1916, Jinnah was focused on securing minority safeguards within a unified India. But even then, his arguments were always anchored in legal structure.
Not just sentiment.
Never just sentiment. He wasn't just asking for sympathetic treatment. He was trying to formalize mechanisms, jurisdictional bubbles, you could call them, where the interests of the Muslim population could be exercised without fear of revocation by a majority legislature.
So when it became clear that a single unified structure couldn't guarantee that,
the demand had to shift. It shifted from seeking jurisdictional protection within a larger state to demanding exclusive jurisdiction over a defined territory. That shift is the culmination of 3 decades of rigorous constitutional thought.
It really speaks to the precision of his approach. The movement wasn't an emotional cry for our historic homeland. It was a methodical constitutional argument for our sovereign jurisdiction.
Yes.
And that subtle but monumental difference, it dictates everything about how Pakistan was conceived, fought for, and ultimately realized.
And that really sets the stage for our next segment. We have to explore why this legal necessity completely overshadowed any sentimental claim to the land.
Okay, let's unpack this further, because this distinction between structure and sentiment is, well, it's the philosophical foundation upon which this entire state-building project rested.
It is.
So we're diving deep into the idea of territory, the necessary precondition for rights. Can you elaborate on the difference between viewing land emotionally versus the way Jinnah approached it, purely legally?
Certainly. When political claims over land are based primarily on sentiment, on, shared history, shared culture, ancestral claims, even religious significance, they generate a powerful emotional and cultural solidarity.
Which is very powerful politically.
It is, but within the framework of modern international law and constitutional governance, sentiment alone lacks enforcement power.
What do you mean by that?
It makes the claim vulnerable to being overruled by a superior administrative or legislative power.
So if you simply exist on a piece of land, your political rights are only as strong as the current government administering that land allows them to be.
Exactly.
In a system where you are a perpetual minority, your rights are inherently vulnerable. They're easily revoked by the majority's legislature.
Precisely. For Jinnah, territory needed to be entirely divorced from just sentiment and fundamentally linked to the law of sovereignty. Territory was the necessary precondition for exercising any fundamental right, especially the right to self-determination. The question then becomes, how does a constitutional home protect a population differently than simply existing on a piece of land?
That's the crux of the legal argument. How did he articulate that structural difference?
A constitutional home, which is territory defined by international and domestic law and governed by an acknowledged sovereign authority, protects a population primarily through the establishment of exclusive jurisdiction.
Exclusive jurisdiction, that's the key technical point.
It is. Jurisdiction means having the unchallengeable legal authority to legislate on all matters, to administer justice impartially within that space, and to enforce laws independently of a competing power.
This is a powerful legal barrier. If you don't have that independent jurisdiction, the rights you claim are rights in theory only. They're granted by another power and can be taken away.
Exactly. You may have rights guaranteed on paper, perhaps through minority clauses or specific administrative arrangements, but if you don't have the sovereign mechanism to legislate and enforce those rights yourself, those guarantees are fundamentally contingent.
They depend on someone else's goodwill.
They do. By demanding defined territory, Jinnah was demanding a space where legal rights were no longer contingent. They were absolute because they were backed by the supreme lawmaking authority sovereignty.
This analysis completely reframes the partition movement. It wasn't about finding a geographically picturesque or historically preferred piece of land.
Not at all.
It was about establishing a fully functional judicial, legislative, and executive framework.
Overwhelmingly so. The sources reinforce that the demand for Pakistan was born of a structural necessity, a legal design, rather than sentiment alone.
It's a framework.
It was a rigorous legal framework designed specifically to prevent the ongoing systemic subjugation that arises when a permanent minority must rely on the good graces of a permanent majority for its existence.
So you establish the boundaries to define the jurisdiction.
And within that jurisdiction, you implement laws that guarantee those rights non-contingently. The physical land is merely the essential container for the legal concept of sovereignty.
And here's where we circle back to that aha moment for our listener. This shift in perspective, from a sentimental claim based on shared identity or history, to a rigorous legal claim based on the unavoidable need for defined sovereign jurisdiction. That's the essential insight here.
It is.
It allows us to view the founding of Pakistan not as a political separation, but as a meticulously planned legal project, a constitutional necessity born of 3 decades of failed attempts to secure rights within a unified system.
And that perspective, that the legal objective was paramount, gives us the crucial insight needed to understand the immense compromises that followed.
Right.
If the goal is the constitutional establishment of sovereignty, then the specifics of the physical land where the lines are drawn become secondary, provided the primary goal of jurisdiction is achieved. But pursuing that secondary compromise led directly to an unavoidable, profound heartbreak.
Which we have to address now.
We do.
Yes, that beautiful, rigorous, theoretical legal framework had to face the brutal, physical reality check, immortalized by that term. The moth-eaten compromise. So we've established the theoretical high ground. Territory equals jurisdiction, and this is a constitutional mandate. But in June 1947, reality descended in the form of the Mountbatten Plan, which forced a painful practical compromise.
The Mountbatten Plan, announced on June 3, 1947, was the moment of reckoning. It officially outlined the procedure for independence and partition.
And the key stipulation.
The key stipulation, which was catastrophic to Jinnah's ideal of a contiguous legal geography, required the partition of the two largest, most culturally and economically integrated provinces of British India, Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east.
For someone who had envisioned a clean, constitutionally coherent legal geography that encompassed contiguous Muslim-majority areas, this slicing of provinces was politically and personally devastating.
Absolutely. It meant abandoning the logical geographical boundaries that would have included millions of Muslims who, although geographically contiguous with the proposed new state, suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the eventual line.
They were part of the intended legal geography.
But were sacrificed for administrative expediency.
And that's where Jinnah used that intensely powerful, iconic phrase. He warned that Pakistan would emerge moth-eaten.
Yes.
We can't just let that phrase pass quickly. We need to unpack its profound weight. It's so much more than a casual political complaint.
The term moth-eaten is a specific legal and administrative condemnation. It symbolizes something that was envisioned as whole, logically proportioned, and constitutionally sound, a perfect legal garment, you could say.
Being eaten away.
Being systematically consumed and ruined by arbitrary external forces and the administrative desire for a quick political fix. It suggests erosion from within.
So he felt the core constitutional principles, the logical boundaries that were required to contain the maximal Muslim-majority areas, were being sacrificed for political pressure.
Especially the division of economically vital areas like parts of Punjab and Bengal.
The division of Punjab, for instance, involved areas like Gurdaspur, which had profound implications for communication and access to Kashmir. This wasn't just losing population, it was losing strategic and economic coherence.
That's correct. The sources imply this profound frustration. Jinnah saw the constitutional logic being overruled by external power.
Yet, despite this public disappointment, this admission of a flawed physical outcome, he accepted the Mountbatten Plan.
He did.
And this is the central tension of the founding. Why? Why accept a compromised, a partial reality when the ideal was so clearly articulated?
Well,
I would assume insisting on the perfect borders would have meant delaying the entire independence process, potentially allowing the British to shift the goalposts
or allowing Congress to deny the partition altogether.
Right.
That is the strategic calculation at the heart of the acceptance. It was a choice rooted entirely in the initial constitutional premise. Partial reality was vastly superior to the complete denial of the constitutional objective.
The core objective being?
The establishment of sovereign jurisdiction. If he had insisted on the full logical boundaries, risking a breakdown of negotiations, the Muslim population would have been left entirely dispersed without the sovereign constitutional home he had worked to secure since 1916.
So he chose the necessary imperfect container over having no container at all.
That's the choice.
So if the definition of the state is the contract, he secured, say, 60% of a binding sovereign contract rather than pursuing a perfect 100% that might never materialize, leaving him with zero.
That analogy holds the legal weight. He secured the legal goal sovereignty, even if the physical means were messy and compromised.
And they were messy.
The final map, as the sources note, was arbitrary in its physical manifestation. It cut through villages, canals, even homes. But the crucial legal realization is this. While those physical lines were messy and fundamentally wounded the geography, they could not cut the nation's purpose.
The purpose remained.
The underlying constitutional goal of securing defined sovereign jurisdiction remained intact, even if the resulting physical geography was severely flawed.
It requires a massive amount of discipline to make that calculation, to prioritize the abstract legal principle over the concrete geographical losses.
It speaks to the legal mind at work. The compromise was accepted because the legal framework it established, non-contingent sovereignty, was the non-negotiable bedrock.
The land could be negotiated?
The physical territory could be negotiated, but the legal framework could not. However, securing this imperfect contract was only the first step. The second was the execution of the contract. And the boundary commissions were about to demonstrate how poorly the legal principles would actually be implemented.
And that leads us to the crucial segment. The procedural flaws of the Radcliffe Commissions, where the distortion of law delivered the first and most enduring wound to this new legal state. We transition now from the high-level political compromise to the actual on-the-ground procedural disaster that was the drawing of the border, a process meant to be legal, but which became arbitrary.
Deeply arbitrary.
We have to introduce this central and largely anonymous figure here, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, an English barrister with no prior experience in India, tasked with the impossible.
Radcliffe was appointed to head the two boundary commissions, one for Punjab, one for Bengal. And the conditions under which he was forced to work, they defy belief, especially considering the momentous, life-altering nature of his decisions.
The logistical nightmare.
A logistical and judicial nightmare. The sources detail it. The frontiers had to be drawn within an impossible timeline. The commissions were operational for barely 5 weeks.
5 weeks. To draw lines that would determine not only the future of millions of individuals, but also the geopolitical stability of South Asia for the next century.
Yeah.
That level of haste guaranteed error.
It wasn't just the speed, which was lethal enough. It was the complete lack of resources and preparation. Radcliffe arrived in India merely a few weeks before the deadline.
So he was new to the entire context.
Completely. There was no comprehensive, reliable, up-to-date survey data to reference. There was no established historical or legal precedent for dividing such deeply integrated territories based on conflicting criteria.
And critically,
there was no established process for judicial appeal or review for the new governments to challenge the outcome. Radcliffe was given absolute unilateral authority under intense political pressure.
And the criteria he was supposed to use were incredibly complex, weren't they? A mix of technical and demographic factors.
They were. Majority contiguity of Muslim and non-Muslim populations, but also factors like water resources, communication lines, and economic viability.
So let's pause on those criteria because they really reveal the impossible task.
They do. Determining population majorities was complex enough, but then he was asked to consider other factors like keeping canal systems intact or ensuring that vital railway lines and road links weren't cut arbitrarily.
Things he couldn't possibly know.
This required deep, granular knowledge of local infrastructure and hydrology, knowledge that could not possibly be acquired or verified in 5 weeks.
So the criteria, which were meant to lend the process some legal legitimacy, essentially guaranteed arbitrary decisions because there was no time to apply them thoughtfully.
It turned the entire exercise into an arbitrary administrative scramble masquerading as a judicial process.
And Jinnah, the career lawyer, how did he react?
He did not hesitate to condemn this procedural failure. He called the procedure a violation of natural justice.
As a lawyer, that phrase is the ultimate condemnation. Can we detail what specific elements of natural justice he felt were violated?
Well, natural justice at its core demands fairness and transparency in legal proceedings. Jinnah's primary grievances focused on the lack of due process.
For example?
First, the commissions themselves, though theoretically balanced with representatives from the League and the Congress, failed to agree on anything.
So they deadlocked.
Completely, leaving the final decision entirely to Radcliffe, essentially making it a one-man show. Second, there was the lack of public scrutiny and the extreme secrecy of the final decisions.
So the haste, the lack of data, and no appeal mechanism.
It meant the affected parties, the new sovereign governments, and the millions of people whose lives hung in the balance were denied their fundamental right to a fair hearing and transparency.
And this brings us back to Mir's devastating observation, which links the principle to the practice. A state born of law had its first wound delivered by law's distortion.
That single sentence just encapsulates the immense tragedy. Pakistan was founded explicitly to uphold the rule of law, to secure fundamental rights through a defined sovereign legal space, and yet its very physical definition, its constitutional outline, was immediately injured by a fundamentally flawed legal implementation.
It's the core irony.
And the inherited wound of the state. The procedural failure undermined the very principle the state was trying to embody.
And adding complexity is not outright insult. The critical procedural detail is that the boundary awards were kept secret and announced only after independence.
Yes. The implications of that delay are profound and highly destabilizing. Imagine a new sovereign state beginning its life on August 14, 1947, without actually knowing its exact legal, physical boundaries.
That's unbelievable.
They had the legal concept of the state, the constitutional objective of sovereignty, but the physical reality was still ambiguous. This created immediate chaos.
On every level.
Ambiguity over which police or military force was responsible for security in key disputed areas, administrative paralysis regarding tax collection and governance, and most agonizingly, uncertainty for millions of people deciding whether to stay or flee.
So the legal ambiguity didn't slow down the physical volatility, it fueled it.
It absolutely fueled it.
Given the scale of this injustice, the clear violation of natural justice, the rushed timeline, the arbitrary nature of the final delayed lines, the newly formed state was immediately presented with grounds for massive retaliation.
Or at least an immediate political crisis.
Yes, yet the sources highlight a choice of restraint.
Jinnah chose deliberate legal restraint over political or military retaliation despite his profound legal grievance. This was a critical choice that set an immediate, powerful precedent for the new state.
How so?
Despite the wound delivered by law's distortion, Pakistan would answer injustice with discipline. This reinforced the idea that they were a state committed to constitutional means and international legal norms, even when those means had been used against them unfairly.
So it showed that the commitment to the legal process itself, however flawed, was paramount to the nation's identity.
It was. It's a powerful statement of adherence to legality. It ensured that even a physically moth-eaten state remained constitutionally whole in its adherence to the rule of law.
But now we shift from the dry legal geography of the map to the living, chaotic reality. How did this imperfectly defined space immediately transform into a new national and moral identity for the millions who migrated?
That's the key transformation.
We've established that Pakistan was initially conceived as a necessary legal geometry, the container for sovereignty. But as those lines were finalized, however flawed, and the Great Migrations began, that abstract space became intensely personal and profoundly real.
Yes.
Space became inextricably linked to identity.
Absolutely. When millions of people are forced into movement fleeing unprecedented communal chaos and seeking this new constitutional home, the physical space they arrive in transforms its meaning instantaneously.
It's no longer just a place.
The sources stress the profound scale of this transformation. Refugee camps, for example, were not viewed as temporary shelters pending repatriation. They were immediately treated as new towns, the starting blocks of a new existence.
A new beginning.
And the frontiers themselves ceased to be mere administrative lines on a map. They became potent, almost sacred, symbols of faith, endurance, and hope.
And the most tangible example of this transformation must be the city of Karachi. Overnight, it becomes the nerve center and capital of hope for millions.
Karachi's metamorphosis was the physical, administrative manifestation of the new constitutional home in action. It was compelled to absorb a massive, immediate influx of people, talent, and energy.
A huge strain.
It had to transform its civic infrastructure, its economic base, and its identity almost instantaneously to house the new legal, administrative, and political machinery of the sovereign state. It was the physical locus where the legal, objective, exclusive jurisdiction was validated, realized, and implemented in real time.
But Jinnah, as the nation's founder, demanded more than just a functioning, stable geography. He mandated that Pakistan's physical geography must mirror its moral geography. This is a weighty philosophical requirement. What did he mean by that in practical governance terms for a newly defined nation surrounded by chaos?
It meant the physical territory was not just for the protection of its citizens, but for the fundamental validation of the nation's founding ideals.
So, after witnessing the horrors of the partition violence and enduring the injustice of the border drawing,
Jinnah was singularly focused on ensuring that the newly defined territory did not become a place for reciprocal violence, administrative lawlessness, or tribalism. The space was meant for justice, not vengeance.
the legal container had to be filled with ethical content.
Precisely.
So, if the purpose of the state was law, the first law applied had to be moral. How did this translate into administrative action during that immediate post-partition period?
It translated into an immediate insistence on the rule of law and strict administrative discipline. Despite the massive disorder, the government, under Jinnah's direction, had to establish administrative structures like the handling of evacuee property and the immediate resettlement of refugees based on clear legal principles.
Rather than communal sentiment or arbitrary confiscation.
Exactly. This was the complex reality of enacting moral geography. The territory had to be a space where equality before the law was enforced universally, regardless of the community, creed, or province of origin of the new citizens.
This places an enormous immediate burden on the citizen, doesn't it?
It does.
To uphold the high ideals of the state while navigating personal trauma and systemic chaos.
Yes, and you quote Jinnah's urging to citizens, let us build a state where every inch of land reflects equality before law. This statement shifts the burden of validating the legal ideal onto the physical space and the behavior of the people within it.
The territory itself has to prove the point.
The physical territory must actively serve and validate the constitutional purpose. If citizens engage in violence or allow injustice, they are essentially sabotaging the very reason the sovereign state was created.
So if we revisit our initial premise, that the purpose of defining territory was to achieve sovereignty and end minority subjugation, we now see the ultimate moral goal of that achievement, which is justice and equality within that secure, defined space. The legal framework was the means. The moral geography was the essential end.
It creates a perfectly closed loop of constitutional logic. The territory guarantees the law's sovereignty, and the law, in turn, must define the ethical character of the territory.
And if it fails?
If the physical land fails to uphold the moral geography, if it descends into lawlessness or allows profound inequality, then the entire legal project of the state, the very reason for its difficult existence, is fundamentally jeopardized. This vision provided the necessary moral compass for the chaotic beginning of Pakistani nationhood.
This analysis brings us to a compelling final synthesis, where we tie the historical facts of the founding back to Jinnah's constitutional philosophy and the enduring responsibility it represents. We have traced the birth of Pakistan from a long-term constitutional argument for defined jurisdiction, through the painful, moth-eaten reality of the Mountbatten Plan, and finally to the high moral mandate placed upon the new citizens within that space.
Right.
As we conclude this deep dive, let's reflect on the enduring meaning of those initial border decisions.
Borders, even today, fundamentally shape global politics, economic flows, and individual psychology. But Jinnah's vision, as captured in Mir's research, transcended the idea of borders as mere barricades.
He saw them as something else.
He viewed them primarily as responsibilities. A border is not just a line that declares separation. It is a line that defines a zone of accountability and commitment to the people within it.
That shifts the paradigm entirely. It's not simply a declaration of where we stop and they begin.
No.
It's an internal declaration of who we are, what legal principles we commit to and uphold within this defined sovereign space.
And this commitment defines the duality of sovereignty. The sources clarify this powerfully. Borders only protect sovereignty when they effectively shelter humanity.
Okay, what does that mean?
The legal claim to sovereign control is only legitimate and lasting if the state uses that control to provide comprehensive security, justice, and equality for its citizens. If the border merely protects an abstract legal entity but fails the vulnerable people within it, the sovereignty is functionally empty.
This all synthesizes into the profound philosophical tightrope that Jinnah walked, trying to materialize an ideal through an imperfect physical process.
Yes.
The final summary from the source material brings his attention into sharp focus.
It truly is the ultimate legal and ethical lesson derived from the study of legal geography. Space without justice is wilderness. Justice without space is illusion.
Let's dedicate some time to those two phrases.
Please.
Space without justice is wilderness. So, space, the territory, the physical geography, however flawed by the Radcliffe lines, is absolutely necessary. But if justice and the rule of law are not vigorously enforced within that sovereign space, it remains merely raw, untamed, chaotic land. A wilderness, devoid of the very protection sovereignty was meant to provide.
And conversely, you can hold a perfect ideal of justice, equality, and fundamental rights in your mind. But if you do not have the defined sovereign jurisdiction, the space to legislate and enforce that ideal independently, those ideals are merely an illusion.
A beautiful but unrealized philosophical dream.
Exactly. The purpose of the entire 1947 exercise, however painful and fraught with compromise, was to provide that essential legal container to make the ideal of justice real, enforceable, and permanent.
Oh, so what is the enduring takeaway for us as informed listeners? The physical lines of 1947 were drawn in haste, defined by compromise and procedural distortion. Yet the constitutional ideals behind them, the quest for justice secured by defined territory, remain timeless.
They do.
Our task, as those who inherit and study this history, is to recognize the gravity of those initial lines and strive to ensure that the physical definition of the state continues to honor the legal and moral principles upon which it was founded.
And this leaves us with a necessary, provocative final thought, given the deep dive into law and procedure we've undertaken today.
Let's hear it.
Considering the constitutional origins of the state and the immense rush that characterized the partition, how does that initial wound delivered by law's distortion, that flawed, hurried, and arbitrary implementation of the Radcliffe Awards, continue to influence a state that was built on the very bedrock of meticulous constitutional logic? What does it truly mean for a nation to inherit a flawed, injured, physical beginning while simultaneously maintaining an immaculate ideal of justice and sovereignty? That deep structural struggle between the ideal and the historical reality remains the defining, continuing feature of its history.